been listening. Austin, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
We sure do. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and thank you very much for being willing to do this over the telephone. Everybody, Austin Gerig from the SEC.
Thank you. Thanks, Pat. I assume some of you have heard about a government shutdown that happened recently, and unfortunately that played a little havoc with my travel schedule. So I appreciate that I'm able to talk over the phone, and hopefully we'll be able to get through this. I'll cue when the next slide should go on, so I anticipate that we'll be able to get through it. I wanted to talk about two things. One is the recent U.S. and EU timing requirements that have come online over the last year. And then the second is some research that I and some of my staff have done here in DERA, the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis. So this research is looking at timing patterns that we found in U.S. equity markets, and I'll give a description of why we think these are important and why they're interesting when I get to that later on in the talk. So the first thing is a disclaimer. So these views that I express are my own. They're not necessarily the views of the SEC. So if you could go ahead and click to the next slide, the overview. So again, the overview, the first thing I'd like to talk about is these new requirements for clock sync that are in the Consolidated Audit Trail, the rule, and also the plan of the Consolidated Audit Trail, and then also MiFID II, which covers European securities. And then again, the second bit is going to be discussing the timing patterns that we found in U.S. equity markets. And I think that and I'll just describe real quickly, I think this is important because most people believe that having very precise clocks and very, very precise timestamps is only so that you can do market reconstruction and discern whether or not a certain event happened before another event. And I kind of want to push the envelope here and find other ways in which having precision timestamps allow regulators and potentially also traders to do interesting, new, fun things. Okay, so go ahead and click to the next slide, which is the CAT requirements. So this is pulled from the CAT NMS plan. It is the requirements for clock sync for U.S. equity and options markets. And this is the wording exactly from the plan. It says each participant shall, and so participants here are the SROs. They're the self-regulatory organizations. They are FINRA, and also the exchanges. And the participants themselves need to synchronize their business clocks to a minimum of 100 microseconds of NIST, okay? Industry members, and so that's right below, industry members are the members of the participants. So these are the broker-dealers who trade and also facilitate trade on the trading venues. These industry members or broker-dealers need to synchronize their business clocks to within 50 milliseconds of NIST. And so those came online, those requirements for the trading venues, the SROs, and then also the broker-dealers, which are those who facilitate trade and trade on the trading venues. Those came online in March 15th, 2017. Those requirements, as part of the CAT NMS plan, were in force in March 15th, 2017. Okay, go ahead, next slide, MiFID II requirements. So this is pulled directly from the EU page, which is describing RTS 25, the regulation which governs clock sync for MiFID II, within MiFID II. And in MiFID II, it states that trading venues need to synchronize their business clocks to coordinated universal time. So there's a slight difference here in the U.S. equity and options markets with CAT, it's NIST. In EU, and for EU, it's specifically NIST in the U.S., but in the EU, it's generally coordinated universal time. And then furthermore, the compliance here in MiFID II needs to have traceability to UTC. So that's an interesting additional thing that is specified in MiFID II that isn't explicitly mentioned in CAT and isn't explicitly mentioned in U.S. regulation. And furthermore, that traceability needs to go all the way to the timestamp itself. Okay, so these are subtle differences, but they potentially are important differences between U.S. and EU regulation. U.S. it specifically states NIST. EU, it's UTC. And then furthermore, U.S. it's agnostic, or it doesn't specifically mention traceability of the timestamp. But in MiFID II, it does explicitly state traceability to the timestamp. Next slide, then. This shows you the level of accuracy for MiFID II. And again, going back, this is kind of in comparison to the U.S. regulation. In U.S., the trading venues are at 100 microseconds of NIST, and the broker-dealers, those who trade on the trading venues, are at 50 milliseconds of NIST. For the EU and MiFID II, trading venues are at 100 microseconds. If they are labeled fast trading venues, they need to be within 100 microseconds of UTC. And if they're not labeled fast, they're 1 millisecond of UTC. And then for those who trade on the trading venues, the broker-dealers, they're within 100 microseconds. If they're labeled a high-frequency algorithmic trading technique, it's within 100 microseconds of UTC. They need traceability of timestamps. And then for the bulk of other trading activity, it's 1 millisecond. And then for manual orders, it's 1 second. And that also is specified in CAT for manual events and manual orders. It's 1 second. And go ahead and the next slide. This shows kind of a review then of the similarities and differences of CAT and MiFID II requirements. And again, just kind of going through this very quickly, the reference clock is different. For CAT, it's NIST. It's specifically specified as NIST. For MiFID II, it's UTC. For traceability, there's no explicit timestamp traceability in CAT. For MiFID II, it is traceable to UTC. For trading venues, the bulk of trading venues, which are the exchanges, and then to the extent that FINRA is timestamping things, it's to 100 microseconds in the U.S. for CAT. It's 100 microseconds for fast trading venues. For all off-exchange trading, so this is trading that happens in ATSs and these things called dark pools, off-exchange, and those are broker-dealer facilitated. Because they're broker-dealer facilitated and they're associated with broker-dealers, then it's the 50 millisecond requirement, which is in place for them in the U.S. And for MiFID II, if you're labeled a fast trading venue, even if you're a broker-dealer run trading venue, a dark pool, you would have to be at 100 microseconds. If you're not labeled a fast trading venue, no matter whether you're an exchange or a broker-dealer, it's 1 millisecond. And then broker-dealer clock tolerance. So these are broker-dealer trading activity. In the U.S., it's 50 milliseconds for most activity. And I've noticed there's an error here. This should say 100 microseconds for high-frequency algorithmic trading activity in MiFID II, and 1 millisecond for most other activity in MiFID II, and then it's 1 second in both for manual events. So again, just kind of going through the table, there's slight differences here. The reference clock, traceability requirement, slight differences in trading venue tolerance and also broker-dealer tolerance, and in both instances, the MiFID II tends to be a bit more stringent in the way that it is requiring synchronization for clocks and then also the traceability requirement. So next slide is getting into the research that myself and several of my staff members undertook. We were motivated by an article that came out, I believe it was about a year ago now. It came out in, it looks like May 2017, where Morgan Stanley quants were noticing some interesting timing patterns in Tokyo on some of the trading activity that they were observing in Tokyo. And then also there's an academic paper that also noticed some interesting patterns in the way that timestamps occurred at trading venues, and that's Hasbrook and SAR 2013. They were finding that trades tended to happen on the round second, so that it looked like trading firms were pulsing their orders and trading on round seconds. And they suggested in that paper that it would go away because once everyone knows it, that's potentially a way for others to sniff out trading activity and take advantage of it. So we were interested in seeing whether or not that's the case. Did it go away or not? Is it still there? And what exactly does it look like? So that was kind of the motivation for us doing this research. And then again, the other motivation is simply that as timestamps become more precise, we more of these patterns potentially can be seen. And, we wanted to push the envelope a little bit and really figure out ways in which, as regulators, as a regulator, we can use that more precise timestamp in addition to the ability to order events correctly on the exchange and off exchange. And so I should also mention one more thing about the timing requirements, which were discussed for CAD and also for MiFID II. If you notice, those requirements for trading venues are around 100 microseconds, and they're not quite at 100 microseconds in U.S. trading venues that are off exchange, and they're not quite 100 microseconds for slow trading venues in MiFID II. And if you really want to be able to sequence events, I've argued that you should be using one way to look at the tolerances is to set them so that you can sequence events across geographic distances. Because within any trading venue, you should be able to sequence events because the matching engine itself has a record of how things were sequenced. But when you have two separate trading venues which are separated by a certain distance, it's very difficult to know which event happened before the other unless you have very synchronized clocks. So you can do kind of back-of-the-envelope calculations, and I think last year when I was discussing this at this workshop, this conference, I really was focusing on understanding what those latencies were between the trading venues. And at least for the U.S., the latencies between trading venues, just due to we're getting close to the speed of light actually for the ability for a trader on one venue to observe something and then react to it in another trading venue. Those latencies are right around close to what the speed of light limitation is for those geographic distances. And if you look at the distances, they're right around 100 microseconds or more for the speed of light. So that 100 microsecond requirement is meaningful. At least it's meaningful in the U.S. for the geographically placed trading venues, the major exchanges in the U.S. They're a little bit over 100 microseconds apart from each other. So that is, it would be nice to be more precise, but at least that's a good start because it allows us, as researchers and regulators to decompose and figure out whether or not something happened on one trading venue before another, because we know that, for example, if the clocks are synced within 100 microseconds or less of each other, and I guess it's technically 200 microseconds because it's plus or minus, but with that, we have fairly good confidence that it would be that you're getting close to this speed of light limit for somebody observing something on one exchange and then reacting on the other. And so therefore we can say with certainty or with some certainty that one event did occur on this exchange before the other event on the other. So anyway, I thought that was kind of an interesting tidbit and probably something to think about when we're thinking about setting the clock sync requirements. Okay, so I'll go into this research now. So the next slide is the motivation, and so I'll go over this. I've kind of spoke to this already a little bit, but the motivation is really the following question: why would firms or trading venues have different timing patterns? And I think there's three different reasons why firms or trading venues would have different timing patterns. And again, that's what we're investigating is the timing patterns of that occur in timestamps for firms and also for trading venues. One possibility is they have differences in trading system architecture and sophistication. Another possibility is that there's differences in trading system locations. And then finally, there could be differences in the strategies used by those who are trading. And each one of those can lead to different timing patterns for timestamps. And so therefore, one purpose of categorizing patterns and studying patterns are so that these timestamps and the patterns can reveal information on a trading venue's technological sophistication, its location, and or its trading strategy. And each one of those things might be interesting to a regulator or in fact might be interesting to market participants. Okay, so the next slide, questions. So these are the questions that we're going to ask. The first one, do patterns exist in timestamps and time lags of U.S. equity transactions? And then second, can we explain these? What can explain these patterns? And we're just kind of scratching the surface here. We don't have full understanding of where the patterns are coming from, and I'll show you what the patterns are in just a few minutes. But anyway, this is still early work. Next slide, data. So the data we use is actually publicly available data. You have to pay money to get this data, but it's publicly available. A lot of academics use this data. It's called TAC data, or trading quote data. And this is data containing SIP messages, and so which are equity trade and quote. So this is the consolidated tape of trading and top-level order book quotes. We use the participant timestamp field, which is the timestamp that's applied by the trading venue. We drop duplicates of symbol, exchange, date, and time. So in other words, if we have a trade that occurs on an exchange at the exact same time, so multiple trades that all happen at the same time, this is oftentimes a transaction that is very large and eats away at multiple orders in the order book, and that's all given the same timestamp. For those, we drop them and only include one, so that we're not looking at kind of timestamps, multiple timestamps, all of which occur at the exact same time for the same security on the same exchange. So the next slide, two measurements. So these are the two things that we're going to measure. The first thing is the timestamps themselves, the timestamp of the transaction. We're actually looking at the timestamps of transactions. So if a transaction occurred at 9:01 in the morning and 50 seconds and 2 milliseconds, it's that timestamp itself, 9:51 and so on all the way down to the milliseconds. That's the first thing we look at. And then the second thing we look at is the time between transactions. So this is the delta. So we're looking at actual timestamps. That's the first thing. The second thing is the delta between two transactions. And so and that's just a simple, you take two consecutive transactions and take the difference between the two. And that's the second thing that we look at. Okay, next slide, transaction timestamps. So here, I'll show you the results for the timestamps themselves. The null hypothesis here, so is a uniform distribution of digits. So if you believe that trades occur at random times and they're just randomly pulled and people randomly are making decisions about trading at different points in the day or at different times, then you would expect a uniform distribution of digits. You would expect that to see that a timestamp of 1 millisecond for the clock is just as likely as a timestamp for 2 milliseconds, just as likely as a timestamp for 50 milliseconds, just as likely as a timestamp for 52 milliseconds, and so on and so forth. All of those should be equally likely. That's the null hypothesis. So let's see how close we are to that null hypothesis when we actually look at the distribution of different timestamps, and that's the next slide. So again, it's labeled transaction timestamps, but now there's a plot on the left-hand side, and on the left axis, the vertical axis, is this proportion. So this is a count. It's similar to a count. It tells you how often the different timestamps occur. And then on the x-axis, and I know it's probably pretty small in the room there, but that's showing you all of the different milliseconds in the timestamp. So this is from 0 all the way up to 999, because those are the different ways that those are the different milliseconds you can have. There's 1,000 different milliseconds that you can observe in the timestamp from 0 all the way up to 999. And you'll see that 0 and very, very small, and 0, 1, 2, and so on are much more likely to occur because you see the peak there than any of the other milliseconds. So that's telling us that it still is the case that timestamps are much more likely to be at or near whole seconds than fractional seconds. Then also you'll see spikes tend to occur at other times, and those spikes are at tenths of seconds. So most certainly algorithms in the market are firing off at non-random times. They're firing off at times that are synced with their clock to be at whole seconds and then also tenths of seconds. And you would only observe this if everyone had clocks that were sync together in the market, right? Because if the clock of a trading firm is set to go off in whole seconds, but that clock itself is randomly off of NIST or randomly off of UTC by several seconds, then in effect, their timestamp when it gets timestamped at the trading venue itself will be randomly. Is completely random. So this kind of an effect can only occur for two, as kind of a cross section of two things. One is it's showing me that the clocks are pretty well synced across the trading venue and these trading algorithms that are firing these. And then the second thing is that the trading algorithms that are firing it, these orders are not random. They're happening at whole seconds most often, and then also at tenths of seconds. So anyway, you can see the possible explanation here. Many algorithms are programmed to fire off orders at whole seconds instead of randomizing time. Okay, next slide. I'm going to show you the results now for time between transactions. And again, so this isn't the absolute value of timestamps. It's not the timestamp itself. It's the difference between two different timestamps. The null hypothesis here is an exponential, and that just comes from if you assume random independent events, that's called a Poisson process, and you expect there to be an exponential distribution of the time between different events. It's just a well-known mathematical result. And then the next slide shows you the result when we aggregate across all exchanges. This is what it looks like. It is different than a Poisson, and I apologize for not, or different than an exponential. I apologize for not showing the exponential over the top here, but it has a fatter tail. You get distance. You get the time between transactions, which is much longer than you would expect given an exponential distribution. Another thing that's of interest here is that you see a hump and the distribution around 200 microseconds. So again, on the left-hand side is telling you kind of an overall count, how often it happens that you observe this lag of timestamps. And then on the x-axis on the bottom is, and I apologize again, it's too small, but it's looking at lags of microseconds from 0 to 500. And there's a hump there around 200 microseconds. And that's suggestive that there's two different processes that might be at play here, one that kind of decays to that 200 level, and then another that decays more rapidly afterwards. That's also interesting because, as I mentioned before, 200 microseconds is about the geographic distances for the speed of light between the various exchanges. So that may be another reason why you see a hump here at 200 is because there's reactionary events that happen across exchanges. An event will happen on one exchange, and then people will race to another exchange to actually trade on the other exchange as well. You would observe that as a preponderance of activity below and around 200 microseconds, which is why you might see that hump there. Okay, next slide. Now we're looking at the time between transactions, not across all of the exchanges, but at one exchange itself. This is for the NASDAQ Stock Exchange, and this is trades in Apple. And you see some interesting results here. This looks like there's peaks in this distribution at different times. And again, it's microseconds on the bottom. It goes from 0 to 500. There's a peak that tends to occur around 40 microseconds, 75 microseconds, 200 microseconds, 240 microseconds, and so on. And you can see them as humps in the distribution. And we call these, or at least we're terming it, echo transactions. So and again, so this is the time lag between two transactions. It's very likely that you'll observe transactions which happen, and again, there's a peak around 0. So you'll get a lot of transactions which happen right around the same time in NASDAQ. But then you'll see kind of a follow-on transaction which happens an awful lot around 40 microseconds. Less so, but still more often than what you would expect by just a simple decay of the distribution, 75 microseconds, 200 microseconds, 240 microseconds, and so on. And again, that's why we would call it echo transactions, because these are sequential transactions. Possible explanation for this is that algorithms react immediately to transactions but are located at different geographic locations and therefore take different characteristic times to cause reactionary transactions. So there's a couple different reasons why you would expect there to be these peaks in the echoes. One is this geographic distance. Another is there's a certain time lag that it takes for a transaction to occur on an exchange, and for that to disseminate to the co-located machines at the exchange and then go back in as reactionary transactions to what the traders have observed on the exchange. So this is telling us information about the length of cables in a trading venue between the matching engine and the algorithms. It also gives us information potentially about the geographic distances between the various important trading hubs and U.S. equity markets. Next slide. This is showing different patterns that exist at the various exchanges. It's showing NASDAQ again, but now it's also showing BATS and NYSE. And you can see that these echo patterns look different for the various exchanges. And again, that might be because the geographic distances from those locations are different, and then furthermore, the sophistication of their matching engines themselves and the lengths of cables from their matching engine to the co-located trading platforms and trading machines in their own data center can have different lengths as well and different kind of characteristic times. We spent a little bit of time actually trying to cluster. We did cluster analysis on the various exchanges to see whether or not, and this is just an unsupervised machine learning technique, to see whether or not there was, we could see patterns in the way that these exchanges, these characteristic fingerprints of the various exchanges, whether or not they had overlap based on any kind of characteristics of the exchanges. And we did that in the next slide, and that's the slide entitled Cluster Analysis. And you can see here, based on the cluster analysis, we find clusters that are based on geographic location. So that's helping to let us know that the data is telling us the reason why. So, for example, you can see the NASDAQ exchanges all looking very similar. They're all clustering together on the right-hand side of this cluster diagram. And that means that in their characteristic patterns, kind of that fingerprint that I showed on the previous slide for all of the NASDAQ exchanges, are similar to each other. First, second, they're most similar to IEX, and there's reasons why you would expect them to be most similar to IEX because they're geographically closer located to IEX. And then you see the BATS exchanges, and then you see NYSE, and then you see the NYSE exchanges as well. So we think that this is telling us that it probably is because these the patterns that we're seeing of the delta between transactions is really due to geographic location. It's probably also due to a couple other things, but that seems to be the first order effect here. Okay, final slide, the conclusions. So transaction timestamps can reveal information about, or at least we believe they can, reveal information about trading strategies, about geographic location, and about technological sophistication. And our preliminary analysis, and again, that's over and above what the initial kind of impetus for doing clock sync within markets. Again, the most important thing is it allows us to do proper sequencing of events across exchanges so we can decompose when there is a widespread market event, and also so that we can establish or at least not rule out causality when we're looking at manipulation or other types of activity in markets. So that's the first and foremost reason why you would want timestamps to be synchronized across all of the different trading venues and also the trading algorithms or the broker dealers who are sending orders into the market. But we also think that they can reveal information about trading strategy, geographic location, and technological sophistication. Our preliminary analysis suggests that many trading firms do not randomize the timing of their algorithms, and that the implication here is that the trades of many firms might be more predictable than they realize. And then the second thing is that geographic location plays an important role in determining time lag patterns. And the implication here is that time lag patterns might be used to reveal a firm or venue's location. So, that's kind of interesting. If you just look at timestamps, and you may not have known this from the outset, but just looking at timestamps, you can probably reverse engineer the location of a trading algorithm just because it's sending out orders to various locations, and those timing patterns give us information about geographic location, which is interesting. So that's the end of the presentation. So I'm open, and I'm not sure how much time I have left, but I'm open to taking any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. We have time for one question, and then what we'd like is if you have further questions for Austin, to send them emails to Lauren, and she will forward them to Austin, and Austin will respond. So who had their hand up first? Leon?
Hi, Austin. It's Leon from NPL. I just wanted to find out, since the implementation for the SROs in March last year, have you seen any enhanced clarity in the markets? Was one. And do you see a change towards the 100 microsecond for the rest of the sector moving towards the MiFID II regulation over the next year or so?
Thanks, Leon. So excellent questions. The answer to the first question is we're not ready yet to disclose any information on what we've seen. So I'll just not mention anything on that front. And then your second question on, do we see any kind of movement towards that 100 microsecond standard and tightening up a bit of the clock sync requirements, at least in the U.S.? I would state that the CAT NMS plan, or the CAT plan, requires that those in charge of CAT, and again, it's not the SEC who's in charge of implementing the consolidated audit trail. It is the SROs, the self-regulatory organizations, which are the exchanges and FINRA. They're in charge of implementing the consolidated audit trail. They're required to review the clock sync requirements every year, and they've done that already. They did that once. Based on their analysis, and I believe all of this is public, but based on their analysis, there isn't anything in the works currently to make it more stringent, but that could be reviewed, that could change in future years. And I would highly recommend that so oftentimes, and you'll see it in the clock sync reports that come out, and in the latest one that came out from the CAT NMS plan, they're relying on industry members and participants to respond to surveys, and then they base their decisions based on what the industry members are saying. I think it's extremely important that experts in the field of clock synchronization are the ones who are weighing in here, and not necessarily those who are not necessarily just the industry participants, which are the broker dealers and trading venues. It's important that those who are experts in the field of precision timing weigh in. So I can help facilitate kind of that connection, but I would appreciate, from those who are experts to weigh in and to provide comments to the CAT advisory board, and also the CAT governance committee and the CAT structure that's set up to inform them on what's feasible, possible, and realistic.
Thanks, Austin. I'll catch up with you after on that front. Thank you.
Yep, thanks.
Austin, thanks very much. I think everybody thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. It was very informative. And like I said, if there's any further questions for Austin, please email them to Lauren Lehman at addis.org, and she will forward them to Austin, and he will endeavor to get back to you. Austin, thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.